very much. And a very warm welcome to this morning's Planning Committee. In accordance with Section 43 of the Local Government in Scotland Act 2003, it's been directed that this meeting will be conducted in such a manner as to allow remote attendance by elected members. In accordance with Section 50 of the Local Government in Scotland Act 1973, the public are excluded from this meeting, as it is likely that if members of the public were present, there would be a real and substantial risk to public health due to infection or contamination with coronavirus. This meeting will be live streamed. First area, can we find out if there's any apologies?
Thank you, Convener. We have apologies submitted by Councillor Alexander. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And as I said before, we wish Councillor Alexander all the best in his recovery. Second item on your agenda is declaration of interest, and just for clarity, I'll read this out. Members should declare any financial and non-financial interest they have in any item of business at the meeting, identifying the relevant agenda item and the nature of the interest. Have we any declarations of interest at this time? No? Okay, thank you very much for that. Takes us to item 3, which is the minutes, pages 3 to 7 in the agenda. The minutes of meeting of the Planning Committee held on the 20th of January 2022. Can we agree the minute, or are there any questions arising?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay, thank you very much. That takes us to item 4, which is construction of domestic garage retrospective at 30 Allen Crescent, Dunnipace, Denny, for Mr. Jason Secker. It's pages 8 to 29. It was the subject of a site visit, and the report is by our planning officer, Mr. John Cooney. Thank you, Mr. Cooney.
Thank you, Provost, and I'll just get Bernard to share the site visit photos so members can just re-jog their memory on what was seen on site. Right, so as the Provost alluded to, the application at 30 Allen Crescent was continued at the previous January 20th committee meeting so that an unaccompanied site visit could take place. And that took place on January 31st, and the update report is provided in your papers. The report seeks to address members' questions which arose during the visit. The update report also acknowledges the receipt of 2 recent objections which reiterate concerns previously raised in objections to the original proposal. To recap, the proposal seeks retrospective permission for a single-storey domestic garage outbuilding in the southwest corner of the application site. This outbuilding is intended for personal use associated with the applicant's hobby of stock car racing and is not intended for commercial use. The proposal requires planning permission by virtue of its height, and whilst recent noise and air quality concerns have been raised with the Council regarding the site, planning officers consider it more appropriate to address such matters separately through environmental health legislation. So in essence, we're looking at the principle of the structure in this planning application rather than what the applicant does for personal use within it. Officers further consider that in this instance, the proposed retrospective domestic garage outbuilding would accord with local development plan policies subject to planning conditions, and that the matters raised in public representations do not constitute sufficient grounds for refusal of this planning application, and therefore officers are recommending the application for approval. Thank you very much, Provost.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooney. Could I say at this stage that the advantage of going out and site visits was very prevalent when we went out here. There were some members, obviously, for different reasons, couldn't make the site visit, but it was fortunate, I believe, that we did go out there, because you get a different interpretation when you see the site for itself, and I'm quite sure that members will be saying that this morning. So I'm going to open it up for members. Anybody like to come in? Councillor Blackwood.
Yeah, I went out and saw the site, and I didn't have any problems with the building. I think from a planning perspective, we're talking about dealing with an environmental situation in a separate entity, and I think that's where my concerns lie. There are complaints, or one of the complaints was that the unit was being used at 3 o'clock in the morning, And I know we've laid down timescales for operation of the garage, but how do we police that? I know it's moving away from but I think that's a concern of mine, is the environmental issues, the dust and the noise. And for a hobby, it can't be used on a Sunday. That's when most people would spend their hobbies as a weekend. How's this going to be policed?
I think we've got an environmental officer here with us this morning. Would you like to come in, sir? Mr. Gray?
In this one, as you know, Graham Webster joined us. But for that,
Excuse me, we can't hear you very well, Mr. Gray. Could you maybe turn your volume up or get closer to the mic? Thank you.
I was saying that Graham Webster joined in Queen's Stature, and I think he conveyed at that point that we had previous concerns raised. Can you still not hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but not very loud. But if you speak up, we're fine.
Go ahead. The issues there. Okay, thank you. The noise issues in this one are reasonably complicated in the sense that to be dealt with as antisocial behaviour by a conflict resolution team in housing, not necessarily by environmental health, because it's effectively domestic noise. So that could present a challenge, or something could be addressed. He was operating at 3 o'clock in the morning, then officers could visit, witness noise and serve notice, or either under antisocial behaviour legislation or under nuisance if it was to come back to environmental health.
Okay. Back to you, Councillor Blackwood.
I'm surprised that air pollution is conflict resolution team's problems. Surprises me.
Right.
Because it's confused about air conditioning and noise levels.
Okay. Anything else, Councillor Blackwood?
No, that's me, Provost.
Councillor McCluckie, see your hand up.
I always take a lead for a local, well, listen earnestly, you could say, to a local member. And I always like to try to encourage people who have hobbies, certainly in this dark time of lockdown. I used to fly pigeons and I had a very large loft in the back garden, and the neighbours were very understanding. Sadly, not many people flies pigeons now, but and obviously health doesn't allow me to do it either. But so I do understand the desirability for a hobby. Like to go back to environmental health or to building standards, because I know that when we get premises and pubs and other places, there's a whole host of acoustics things that we ask for, double insulating inside, you know, that suppresses noise and all these things that we insist happens. So because this is maybe grinding and sorting things and things, I just don't see how we, because I've no problem with the structure as a local member is done, but you know, I have got a concern that there certainly would be noise in the future if measures didn't get taken, insulating and things to suppress the noise inside. And I'm aware, being obviously a joiner in the past, that there's things that can be put inside the walls to suppress the noise and that. So I would like more information on that, because that is my concern. And I know normally it's not a planning thing, but it does come into effect in planning on other buildings and premises. So I just find it strange that in this site that conflict resolution would be the way forward, when we can insist that certain measures get put in the building to help the situation. That's all, Provost.
Okay, we'll go back to Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray, you heard Councillor McCluckie. Is there any conditions that we can take to mitigate the problems?
Not at this stage, and not pertinent to planning particularly. I think that one of the issues that that I maybe should highlight is the informative that's been added to this is the standard construction informative. So the hours that are prescribed in that are not hours for the hobby activity of that garage. You can use the garage on a Sunday. It's that, you know, when they're doing the ongoing construction works, they can't necessarily operate on a Sunday or without out with those hours. So there is really no control at this stage. For us, we would, as I say, initially it would probably be treated as antisocial behaviour because it's domestic noise. We would get involved generally in commercial noise, and one of the aspects I noticed in this application is whether this is a domestic use, which we've classified it is a domestic use, or whether there's a business interest. If it was a business interest, it would certainly come to us, and we would be looking at some of the restrictions that Councillor McLuckie suggested. But there are no limiters that we could fit for somebody angle grinding or welding or generally making a noise, making stock cars. So I think the key thing would be the hours of operation. And the only observation I would make is when my officer has been in contact with the applicant, they did get a reasonable response to the hours of operation. But again, that is before a planning application, when their interest is to get a planning application approved and show that they're being cooperative. So he certainly seems to have been cooperative so far. So I would hope, we'd be hopeful that we could get a resolution. But I think, as you'll have seen yourself, it's a residential area. You're introducing a large garage, and we know that his activity is going to be noisy. So I think Graham said at the meeting that you know, he does expect that there will be problems with it, and we may have to deal with that from our perspective. But again, whether that's pertinent to the construction of a large garage for domestic use is difficult to say.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gray. Other members want to come? You want to come back, Councillor McLuckie, on
I'd
that?
like to come back in there. I'd like to ask Bernard for his advice on this, because normally this building was constructed before it got planning permission. And normally what happened was we would give planning permission, and then we would build and show us some checks that everything's fine and whatever. So I'm looking to see if Bernard we've heard from the environment team, but I'm looking for the building side, if there's some simple things that we could stipulate here that would help everybody, you know, and allow the man to enjoy his hobby, but protect the people. So I'd like to hear from Bernard, please.
Yes, Mr. Whittle, would you like to come in at this stage?
Thanks, Councillor. Yeah, again, maybe not pertinent to consideration of the planning application, but there is a building warrant application that's been submitted for this building and has been approved. In terms of consideration of things like sound insulation, there's a requirement there for the developer to meet the requirements of the building standards for ancillary domestic buildings. In relation to the concerns that have come up, the council can't require the occupier to go beyond or put in more insulation that would be required by the building standards.
Okay. Do you finish, Councillor McLuckie? I've got Councillor Murtagh. Right, Councillor Murtagh?
Thanks, Provost. And I think, like yesterday, your picture keeps freezing, but I can kind of hear the sound, so I'm presuming that that'll be the same with me. So I'll just keep talking, but if I freeze, can you just yell at me?
Yep.
Thanks. It's a strange setup I've got at the moment. I suppose my question is kind of around, you know, the questions have been said, what Bernard just said. It's whether, so if this was a commercial operation doing exactly the same hobby, exactly the same thing, but in a commercial basis, that's kind of the issue, is that we would, as a planning authority, be able to judge it differently then, as in we would, in terms of the conditions, would we be able to look at having to require insulation for essentially what's the same activity, or soundproofing? I'm thinking about some of the other applications that we've judged, you know, where we were looking at maybe car washes or things like that. We were looking very much at saying this is a commercial activity, it's going to have the impact on the neighbouring properties, it will be sound, it will be whatever. We will therefore ask for conditions to be put in to mitigate that. But what seems to be different here is that because the activity is, it's a case of we're judging an ancillary outbuilding. So regardless of what happens in that ancillary outbuilding, are we not able to consider any additional measures because it's just that that's a classification of building and whatever happens in it is domestic, regardless of whether it would be the same sort of commercial type activity. It's what we're able to actually consider within the parameters of this application. I would quite like clarity on.
Fine. Either Mr. Cooney, you want to come back on this one, sir?
Absolutely, Provost, and thanks, Councillor Murta, for that question. Yes, we do apply certain policies with regard to ancillary residential or buildings which are ancillary to a domestic premises than we would with a commercial premises. So, for example, there is a policy in the Local Development Plan HC07, which I've addressed within the committee report and explain why that's not relevant in this particular instance. If it was a commercial use, yes, we would be looking for specific mitigation to ensure that a commercial use was compatible with the residential area within which it is situated. But we're in this kind of, I suppose, difficult situation with this particular proposal in that it is ostensibly for a domestic ancillary use, which means we can only assess it under certain policies. And I would point out as well that if the building was lower in height, it wouldn't actually need planning permission at all. So we have to look at that kind of scenario in that scenario where it wouldn't need planning permission at all, it would be the environmental health legislation that we would take forward any noise issues under. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it's a sort of, it's a very frustrating grey area because obviously, you know, we are all very sensible in this committee of the things which we're allowed to consider when it comes to planning applications and conditions we're allowed to, or reasons we'd be allowed to either approve or refuse. But I think it's that difficulty that it is before us. We have to make the best decision for everybody involved, the applicant, the community, etc. And it's trying to find a reasonable, pragmatic way forward. So in effect, the reason it's here is because of height. And there's nothing that planning can do to regulate activity within any ancillary building anyway, if it's domestic. It feels very frustrating that knowing, and I'm not going to declare an interest, although it has occurred to me that having previously, my previous employment and before becoming a councillor was to work for welding engineering company. And I'm now starting to think whether the applicant may have actually worked for that company or not. But it's just literally just occurred to me in the course of this meeting. But I would be aware that activity would require protective equipment for the person undertaking that work, and therefore it is naturally noisy and difficult. It is going to be under difficult circumstances for the neighbours, I can see. But if there really is nothing we can put in a condition, and it's purely on what's before us, I'm not sure what more we can do if it meets the planning regulations and the recommendation. Unless you can advise that there is something we could put within it that would help to, you know, give a stipulation about hours of operation or a stipulation about the type of building material. But from what you've said already, I don't think that's the case.
Yep. You want to respond there, Mr. Cooney, to that last area?
I suppose, and I would ask Bernard to clarify this as well, but there could be a scenario where we could go back to the applicant and ask them, is there anything else they can do to improve the acoustic insulation of this particular outbuilding? However, we wouldn't actually have the policy backing to be able to force them to do that. It would be very much based on their own voluntary endeavours to make the situation better.
Okay. Councillor Kerr. Did you have a question, Councillor Kerr?
Yes, Provost. Thanks. And I really agree with your comments regarding going to site. It was highlighted and allowed us to see the area as well, Provost. I think nice. This is what the rest of the councillors are saying. This is a domestic garage, a large domestic garage, and it should be judged on a large domestic garage. We're not an environmental committee. That needs to be addressed at the appropriate time, in my eyes. I just think that we as a committee need to take it on planning issues. And as Councillor McCluskey says, I take nice to say local members' opinion. And I'll be quite happy to propose that we accept the officer's recommendation.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Whittle, we've got other members got their hands up, but I'll come back to you first in case you've got something that's going to be relevant to what's going to be said in the future.
Thank you, Provost. It was really just to pick up on the point that Mr. Cooney had raised, where he'd referred to myself. It would be open to members, if they feel appropriate, to say possibly add a condition requiring a scheme of further noise mitigation works to be submitted and agreed within a time period. That might be some assistance to help try and resolve concerns that have been raised by local residents and the issues that have come up here. So it's a suggestion. I think it would be legitimate to do that. To leave it open that further details be submitted and agreed.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll get Councillor Grant, Councillor Hughes and Councillor McCluskey want to come back in. Councillor Grant.
Thank you, Provost. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm on my phone.
We can hear you fine, thank you.
Thank you, Provost. It was just Councillor Kerr actually says basically what I was going to say. When I turned up at site, I was kind of surprised at the overall size of the garage. But we are here to do the planning committee, and I'm with Councillor Kerr. We've just got to base ourselves on the planning. I understand the frustration, but on the planning, I think there's not a lot we can do against the applicant. I think we've got to go with the officer's recommendations. Thanks, Wallace.
What you're saying, Councillor Grant, no putting words in your mouth. Are you seconding then Councillor Kerr's motion to approve the recommendations?
Yes, I will do it, Provost.
Okay, right. We've got Councillor Hughes, Councillor. Come back to Councillor McCluskey, but Councillor McHugh wants in, and Councillor Bowes. Councillor Hughes.
Thank you, convener. I was drawn to page 9 of the agenda item 4, page 9, where this development is described as a modest nature of the proposed structure. When I came out, I certainly wouldn't describe the development as modest. Of course, at the end of the day, it's all semantics. What you might describe as modest, I don't think it is a modest structure. However, my main couple of points I'm thinking about here is that the council flooding officer has objected to the proposal. And looking at the development, the corner of this, call it a garage, basically is about less than a foot from the boundary wall, overlooking the watercourse. Although I take it that the judgment is that probably the development when built didn't interfere with the ground close to the boundary wall, I am still concerned about the implications of flooding if the wall collapsed at any point in the future, and who would be responsible for repairing the wall was one of my considerations. The other consideration I had when looking at stock car racing in general, although this application could be described as a domestic application, I am wondering if it could be described as a hybrid, because stock car racing by its nature is an expensive hobby. If you are treating it as a hobby, with large vehicles taking any stock car racing vehicle to, shall we say, I don't know what you call the stock car racing events. Over a period of time, there will be a number of stock car events over the year. So for my thinking, this would obviously attract sponsorship. And does sponsorship by its nature mean that you have an element of commercialism within the hobby? And if that is the case, then I think there is an argument for looking at proportionality in relation to the application, that we have to recognize in that sense, if sponsorship is treated as an element of commercialism, that would that give us any, shall we say, leverage in terms of altering the application?
Okay. I'm going to come back to either Mr. Cooney or Bernard on the issues, obviously the flooding, and then the issue about commercialisation in relation to the chap's hobby. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost. For points there, just in response to the issues raised by Councillor Hughes. With regard to the boundary wall, I suppose the point there was what might happen in the future and how the council might react. There's a maintenance issue there, potentially, if that does arise, and the responsibility would be down to the owner of that wall. I can't really see that issue in itself is material to the consideration of this planning application. It's an assumption about what might happen in the future and how that would then be dealt with, and it's a private legal matter between landowners. In terms of the use of the building, it was just to pull it back to the application that is before members to consider is an application for construction of a domestic garage. It's not a planning application for a commercial building. So that's really where, what members are being asked to consider is what's before them, which is an application for domestic garage. On the basis of what information we have to date, John might comment further. My understanding is that having looked at this, our view is that this isn't a business use. It's not an application or a proposal for a business use. It's an application for domestic building.
Thank you. Bring Mr. Cooney back in that one. You just want to elaborate on that, John?
Absolutely, Provost. Thanks for Bernard for coming in there. Just briefly to go back to flooding and to go back to the fact that the modest nature of the building is within the context of the site. Yes, when taken alone, it is a large building, but this particular plot is quite a generously sized plot. I believe the building takes up less than a quarter of the site itself, and also its footprint is not the reason it needs planning permission. And I'd reiterate what I said earlier about permitted development rights. If the height of the building was lower, particularly at eaves height and near to the boundary lines, it wouldn't need planning permission at all, despite its footprint. So we've had to take that into account when looking at the impact on flooding, particularly flood risk downstream. And we've taken the view, which has gone against our flooding officers in this instance, as the case can be, that it wouldn't have a significant impact on flood risk locally. And then going back to what Bernard said about the commercial use, yes, we are aware that there are concerns raised in objections that there might be a commercial use in the future here, but that's something we're going to have to consider if that arises. At the moment, we're considering the application that's in front of us, and that is for a domestic use or a building associated with the domestic use of the site.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McHugh?
Provost. I do have real concerns about the flood situation, given that a development in my own ward has actually caused flooding due to cut off of a runaway water in building, and as a responsible decision, as all as responsible decision makers in the future, if there is flooding in that area, that cul-de-sac, then is held responsible, given that we are raising this issue and that our flood management team have raised this issue. Now, that's one question. The other question was, I believe already the land that's owned by Falkirk Council round about this development has been badly damaged by vehicles driving over grass. We've already had to spend money maintaining that piece of ground. So what protections can we put in there? I believe it's not just a domestic garage for a hobby. The hobby is spilling out into the area around about it. So, you know, what constraints or what measures can we put in there to protect that area? Because bottom line, we've already raised the fact that there could be possible problems with neighbours in the future due to noise, due to fumes. You know, this is a quiet cul-de-sac, you know, that all of a sudden's got a larger than normal, you could say, garage on it. And I can understand the neighbours in the area are very concerned. Obviously, they're watching what's going on day to day that we don't have the privilege of watching. And when does a hobby become more so, is all the questions that are kind of running about in my head. But certainly the flood problems is an issue. As we say, we can look in the future, but we know that the flooding is becoming a more a problem, and also the land being destroyed, owned by the council round about it.
Thank you. We'll come back to Mr. Cooney on this one, obviously the planning officer, but you did mention, and we had a look when we were on site, at the areas that Councillor McHugh has been addressing about the parking of vehicles obviously coming maybe into that area. So maybe you could try and address the points by Councillor McHugh, Mr. Cooney. Thank you.
Well, I suppose let me just start by saying that it is imperative upon the applicant to manage this site in a better way, because definitely there has been inappropriate parking on green space to the north of this site, which is within the housing department account of the council, and we brought that to the attention of the housing department. They have an ongoing monitoring of the situation in that respect. I would, before I come back to flooding, I suppose, following on from that point, the application is not for the use. The application is for the structure, and we kind of have to not lose sight of that particular aspect of what we're looking at here today. The applicant, to my mind, was already undertaking this hobby prior to the construction of this outbuilding, and had the outbuilding been slightly lower, or about well, not slightly lower, but if it had come within the permitted development height limits, it wouldn't have needed planning permission. It wouldn't be coming before the committee today. So we have to focus on the application that's in front of us, which is for a structure. And whilst I acknowledge and I sympathise with residents' concerns with regard to what has gone on here, there are certain matters that need to be separated out from the planning application itself. and that's why there's that ongoing investigation from the Housing Department, but also from Environmental Health as well. In respect to the flooding, yes, we do take those concerns seriously. In this instance, given the size of the proposal relative to the wider plot and wider area, and the fact that there is an existing flood wall that runs along the riverside from the back of this plot all along past that green space that's owned by the council to the north, we have taken the view that the risk in terms of flood risk in this area and downstream would not be significant, and that's why we've taken the view not to agree with our flooding officer's assessment in this instance.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Bowes, followed by Councillor Blackwood, Councillor Murtagh and Councillor McLuckie. Councillor Bowes.
Thank you, Provost. And looking at this one, I'll declare that one of the things I don't particularly like is retrospectives, but unfortunately that's part of the system which we work in. Listening to Mr. Cooney, and thank you, Mr. Cooney, for your time on site. It helped me quite a bit. If this, you're quite right, if this had been, I think, something like 500 mil lower, which it would still operate under, it might even be less than that, then they wouldn't require planning permission. We wouldn't be here today, and they could have built it just that bit smaller. So therefore, what I would like to do, and I like the way that Mr. Whittle did it. He almost treated it like a 19-1 when John mentioned him, as his name was used. Can I explore a wee bit more what Bernard was saying on a potential condition, and hopefully the people who have proposed to accept this application may consider what Bernard was saying. I'm assuming, Bernard, you're talking about accept it, but with a condition. Can you just expand on that a little bit, Bernard? Because it might be somewhere that we can. There might be somewhere we can go here.
Thank you, Councillor. Provost, to yourself. What I was suggesting on the back of the debate that's gone forward was that if members felt it was appropriate to grant a planning permission, but had concerns about noise and were keen to see if anything else could be done to try and mitigate those potential concerns, you could support the application with a condition requiring the submission of a noise mitigation scheme, details to be submitted and agreed within, say, a set timescale, and then on agreement implementation of those works. So I'm sure we can come out with probably better than I've just put it in a roundabout way, but a definite, clearer wording of that, a condition to achieve that. And that would be, I think, a reasonable condition and would be enforceable, certainly.
Thank you, Bernard. And I'm just asking the proposer to accept and the seconder, would you be willing to add that on to your proposal? Sorry, the dogs are wanting out.
Councillor Kerr, Councillor Grant, you've heard what Councillor Bowes has said and our officer. Would you be happy in your initial recommendation to grant to include that condition? Councillor Kerr first.
Provost, I've not got a problem with it, but can we hear the rest of the elected members first before?
Fine. Councillor Grant, would you have a problem with that?
I don't have a problem, Provost, but I'd just like maybe Mr. Coombs to come back in and Connor come back in next week, because we're here to do the structure. Right,
okay. Right, we've still got Councillor Blackwood, Councillor McLuckie and Councillor Murtagh to come back in with other questions. But Mr. Cooney, you want to come in and address the issue that Councillor Grant has been saying?
In terms of structure, well, first of all, I'll just like to clarify something that Councillor Bowes mentioned in terms of the height. The height nearest the boundary would need to come down quite significantly to 2.5 metres above natural ground level within a metre of the boundary to be considered as permitted development, and the eaves height would need to be lowered to 3 metres. At present, the eaves height is 3.4 metres and the maximum height is 4 metres. So it would be, the structure would look quite different in its location if it was permitted development, unless it was set back from those boundaries. So I just wanted to clarify those comments. And I suppose Mr. Whittle's suggestion of a condition has obviously been borne out by councillors' legitimate concerns in this instance with regard to noise. So I would be happy to, if members were happy to move forward with a recommendation to have an additional condition placed in the way that Mr. Whittle describes, I'd be happy to agree with his view on that.
Thank you. We'll go back to Councillor Blackwood, Councillor Murtagh and Councillor McCluckie. Councillor Blackwood.
Thank you, just very quickly, Councillor Bow stole my thunder. That was exactly the question I was going to pose to Mr. Whittle. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
I agree with it.
Thank you. Councillor McCluckie.
As I said, Mr. Whittle, that's what I wanted them to say earlier on, but I was going to come back in and suggest that as a condition, because I've been listening to Mr. Cooney, but just to remind them that members make decisions, officers make recommendations, and we decide whether we think it's a business or a thing. I mean, officers have made their decision, and it certainly is within a metre of the building, the outside perimeter wall. So, in 1 point, so I would say that would require the permission, even if it was the height. And as I say, the footprint, I think, is bigger than a normal double garage as well. So, but what Bernard suggested is superb. It comes in savour a bit of willingness between the applicant and developer to go and mitigate for the benefit of everybody, to the benefit of the owner, the benefit to enjoy his hobby, and the benefit of the residents. And with that condition, and as I say, I'm minded to grant subject to that. Fine.
Councillor Murtagh, coming back to you.
Thanks, Provost. I was actually, again, like Councillor McCluckie and Councillor Blackwood, going to come in with a similar suggestion, but I think that's the thing that, when Bernard came back in following my previous comments. I think, though, so what I would wonder as well is about the enforceability. Now, the application that is before us is for a domestic garage, so it's not so much a matter of whether it's the officer's opinion or the councillor's opinion of what the use is. At the end of the day, I understand if we were to reject it and there was to be it would need a whole other application for a different classification. What we're judging is the application before us. But in terms of the enforceability, and it always comes down to planning enforcement. If then, without a change of use, commercial activity was to be undertaken at that premises, I mean, what is the route then for the judgment of that? What is if we grant it with a condition about potentially coming back with a scheme to limit noise, etc. in its construction? How do we enforce, or how do we ensure that there isn't commercial activity and that therefore there wouldn't be another application required? Is it through planning enforcement that's going to be monitored, or is it through other means, including the housing department, or informing on and social behaviour, environmental health input putting? Would it be residents that would get in touch with the planning department to say there is now business activity there and it requires a change of use? What's the route for that?
That's a good point. Bernard or John, whoever wants to come in here.
Thanks, Councillor Murtagh. Maybe just to clarify, just thinking about the wording of a condition, what I'm suggesting is that you could have a condition saying, similar to the other conditions recommended, within 6 months of the date of the decision, details of a noise mitigation scheme shall be submitted to the planning authority, approved and implemented, something along those lines. In relation to the other points you were raising, Councillor Murtagh, about business use and what happens in the future, if members are minded to grant the application, it would be on the basis as proposed that this is a domestic garage. If there were complaints in the future or continual complaints, then that would be subject to investigation through planning in conjunction with Environmental Protection Unit colleagues, and there would then, if there was evidence to suggest that that things had changed to an extent, that there was evidence to prove that there was a business use happening on the site, that would be something that could be pursued via planning enforcement.
Okay.
Okay.
So it would be planning enforcement that would then look at what the use of was happening in that garage and making a judgment on whether that was domestic or commercial.
Yeah, I think it'd be fair to say there's it falls between a number of different, there's a number of different aspects to this. I can say that certainly planning would have an input in enforcement in considering whether there's a business use, but potentially under other legislation, and David Gray might keep me right or want to comment on this, there may well be other legislation that would apply, that other action could be taken by the council in respect of things like nuisance, etc. So there's different avenues to this, but certainly potentially there could be a planning enforcement role in the future if there was a planning breach.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll bring Mr. Gray in. Just you've heard what Bernard has said there. Do you want to elaborate on what he's been saying in relation to the situation?
Yeah, thanks. I think as Councillor Hughes, Councillor McHugh and Councillor Murtagh have all said, is that the commercial application could be an issue here. It's commonly an issue with people, not necessarily the stock car side, but people who are repairing cars as a hobby and are perhaps doing it commercially as well from home address. And we often have interaction with planning and the planning enforcement officer in determining whether there is a commercial aspect to that and whether the appropriate planning use. That could certainly happen here, and we would probably pass on any information that we suspect a commercial use to planning at that stage. I think, but again, at this stage, the planning application is only just for the domestic garage. The only other point, there was two points really. The one is the air quality issue, the flue, which is a condition. So if the planning permission is granted, then that requires the removal of the flue, which addresses the smoke issues that we've had in the area. So that's certainly a positive for us. The point that Bernard makes about noise mitigation and a similar condition on that is something that we would probably input to as well, because when we talk about noise mitigation, you're talking about for commercial applications, sound insulation, noise consultants. For this one, we're probably talking about something as simple as hours of operation and keeping the door closed if they're doing noisy activities. So there's certainly some mileage in that, and that could provide some reassurance on the other major area of concern for us, which is obviously noise.
Okay. I would like to ask then, Bernard, if there is a way of, and I know that what we are judging is we are judging a domestic application, and so it's kind of contained within it. But given that you've said the route is through planning enforcement in terms of the issues that have been raised, and particularly the concerns raised by the residents, is there a way of within the planning wording, within the wording of any motion, to emphasise it, to say that it is recognised that no commercial activity shall be undertaken at this domestic, ancillary building, and that any activities contrary would be subject to other planning enforcement. And is there a way of emphasising that within the decision and finding a form of words, maybe Mr. Henderson can advise, that would therefore make it very clear the basis in which we're all judging, and I make it clear I absolutely 100% agree that the applicant has the right to pursue whatever hobby he has, and wish him all the best and every enjoyment of it, but to try to balance it up, is there a way of emphasising that in the wording?
Yes, you could add in an informative. I suppose that's of a form, really, you're laying down a marker for the applicant to make it clear your deliberations that you've still got some concerns about the potential future use of the site, and an informative could be used to make it clear that if the use were to change or alter, that planning permission might be required, and to emphasise any concerns you have about impacts, or asking for consideration of those issues by the applicant. I see John Cooney's got his hand up as well. I don't know.
Yes, John.
Further on that, John.
At present, we actually do have an informative on the what could be the decision notice, depending on what members decide today, and it reads as follows: as informative 3, the garage outbuilding shall only be used for domestic purposes ancillary to the enjoyment of the dwelling house. Planning permission may be required for the introduction of a commercial use on this site in the future. And I would suppose I would just also emphasize as well that the application, that I suppose the proposal we're looking at here on the application form and on what's been here before you is construction of domestic garage, and then retrospective in brackets. So it's very clear what we're looking at, and what, if members were minded to approve, that would be being approved.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and it's you know, appreciate you reading it out. When I read it last night, I thought, well, it doesn't feel as strong as maybe it could be in terms of the may require planning permission in the future type thing. And I think one of the things is that I would say it would, like any application that came forward, you know, if it was for a change of use, it would, I mean, I think what I would like is the emphasis on something about planning enforcement in there, about how it must be. So this must be used only for, you know, not for commercial purposes, and that any, not so much infringement, but any change to commercial use would be subject to planning enforcement and would potentially require, even if you have the would potentially require planning permission. It's that way that if there was a change of use and they didn't put in a planning permission for that change of use, what would be the route? The route would be planning enforcement. That's, you know, so I think it's strengthening that wording I'd feel more comfortable with, to make sure it's clear that that's the purpose, but also that there is a monitoring purpose for that, so that everybody else seeing this application could have that surety.
Bernard, do you want to come back in here?
Yeah. Thank you, convener. It was just to say, maybe just to highlight, you need to be careful. I think there is scope to make the wording of that informative stronger, but obviously I think we also need to be mindful that you can't judge any proposal that comes forward in the future. So if you know, the occupant did decide that he wanted to operate the building for some business use, and there was material change of use, you need to be careful that you're not, in the terms of an informative, the council or committee giving a view that it's predetermined that proposal.
Good point. Okay.
Can I just clarify, Bernard, what I was not saying is that would, what the outcome of a proposal would be, but if there was a change, if somebody, regardless of this situation, changed from a domestic to a commercial use, surely it would require an application, regardless of whether it would be automatically granted or not, or under delegated powers. Would it not require an application?
Well, if there's a material change of use, you can change a use in planning terms without the need for planning permission. I'm sorry, it's getting a bit geeky plannerish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Basically, what I'm asking.
Yes, I mean, I think, yes, we could beef up the wordings to clarify the point about the need for planning permission and the potential for the council would consider or may consider enforcement action in the event of a breach.
I would ask whether the proposers would include a strengthening of the wording to include that it may be subject to planning enforcement, or, you know, so that was put within the condition and clear.
Okay. Right, thank you very much for that. I'm going back to, we're going to bring Mr. Henderson in because he's been taking some notes here. But first of all, go back to Councillor Kerr, first of all, who moved the motion to grant the recommendation contained within the report. You happy for the condition to go in? And Mr. Henderson will read it out. You happy, Councillor Kerr?
Happy with that, convener. But it's a garage, eh? We're judging a garage here.
Aye. Okay. Thank you. Councillor Grant is the seconder. Are you happy?
Likewise, Provost, but it is the structure.
Okay.
Well, Provost, sorry. Well, it's Mr. Henderson that's going to speak next. I've not been in the planning for a while, but could you explain why Councillor Bowes called a 19-1, please?
I didn't call a 19-1, David. I was just having a bit of
There's a bit of banter, I think.
There's been a banter
Oh,
between the two
so-
officers.
sorry,
Yes.
Gary.
No,
Sorry.
no.
It's the way Bernard says as my name was used. Sorry. Sorry
Okay,
to look at that way, David.
Apologies, Provost.
Right, thank you. Just to clarify where we are, we have a motion moved and seconded, moved by Councillor Kerr, seconded by Councillor Grant, to agree the recommendation contained within the report, but there's going to be an extra condition, and Mr Henderson is going to clarify that wording for us before we take a vote on it. Okay, Mr Henderson?
Thank you, Provost. And I think it would just be incumbent on me at this point just to point out to the committee that there are processes for challenge of conditions, and you'll be aware of the requirements for conditions to meet certain requirements under Scottish Government guidance and legislation. That said, I think this is a slightly unique position where we have a retrospective application. And I think we are aware of uses taking place that are maybe creating noise and fume issues. So in a way that you wouldn't normally when it's an application that would come before the construction of a building, I think you're actually seeing something in operation here. So I think that gives stronger grounds for the consideration around a condition. So what we appear to have is a motion by Councillor Kerr, seconded by Councillor Grant, and that is to grant planning permission in accordance with the officer's recommendations. And that's with the addition of a condition. And I'll maybe defer slightly to planning colleagues for their thoughts, but I think there's perhaps a step to be added into the process around a noise mitigation scheme, and that's perhaps for the Director of Police Services to provide an indication to the applicant of the standards, i.e. the kind of output specification on noise that would require to be met. I think there's a slight danger in just saying put in a scheme for approval, and it could be any scheme, and then it's way beyond the bounds of something that could be agreed, and where does that take us? So I think it would be wise, dependent on what Bernard and John think, to say at this stage that it would be to a specification or an output specification as indicated to the applicant by the Director of Police Services. Bernard, I see your hand going up.
I think that's a very good point, Ian. In terms of the tests relating to conditions, we need to be sure that we are being reasonable and proportionate. So, saying a scheme of mitigation probably is a little too vague and could be tightened up as you've suggested.
Thank you, Bernard. So I think what we would be saying is that it would be granted subject to the Director of Police Services advising the applicant of essentially the output specification of what's to be achieved. The applicant would then have, say, a period of 6 months to submit a scheme for agreement, which would then fall into the hands of the Director of Police Services for agreement. And following agreement, you would maybe be looking at a period of something like 6 months for that to be implemented. And at that point, if that wasn't implemented, I would be expecting that enforcement action would be taken. There was also wording that was intended to be amended in the informative, and I'm reading the informative at the moment. I wonder if it's changed from the garage outbuilding shall only be used to the garage outbuilding requires to only be used for domestic purposes ancillary to the enjoyment of the dwelling house. And perhaps some wording then to say a change in use would trigger a requirement for future planning permission for change of use, and a failure to obtain such further permission may result in enforcement action being taken. Does that seem like a reasonable wording? I'm seeing some nodding. That's helpful. So essentially, it's the officer's recommendation with these two amendments, which I noted that Councillors Kerr and Grant agreed with, and which I also note the convener of the meeting agreed with. I think I'm right in saying that, Provost. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You've heard Mr Henderson. Just going back to do it properly here, we have a motion moved and seconded with that added condition contained within with the correct wording. Is there anybody otherwise minded? So we're agreeing. Everybody agreed? Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. That takes us to item 5 on your agenda this morning, erection of dwelling house, renewal of planning permission, land to the southeast of Tappernail Farm, Hillcrest Square, Reddingmuir Head, for Mr Philip McFarlane. It's pages 30 to 46 in your agenda, and the report is by Julie Seidel-Gregory. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Provost. Bernard, can you please show the plans and the site photographs for this application, please? This application relates to the erection of a detached dwelling house at lands to the southeast of Hillcrest Square. The application site sits at the corner of the B810 Shield Hill Road and the access road to Hillcrest Square. This application is a renewal of planning permission P16-0215 full, which was approved on the 10th of July 2017 by the Planning Review Committee. No issues in principle are raised by consultees which cannot be addressed by planning condition or legal agreement. One letter of representation was received objecting to the application on the basis that this application should be refused because the Persimmon Homes application on neighbouring land was refused and there should be no houses built on land that the public use. The application is assessed as being contrary to the development plan on the basis that the proposal does not accord with any of the criteria where housing development in the countryside is supported, and the design of the proposed house is considered that it would not harmonise with existing houses at Hillcrest Square or the character of the wider rural area. Members should note that planning permission P16-215 full can be implemented. The Coronavirus Act 2020 has extended the time period of some planning applications which would have otherwise expired during the emergency period. This means that the planning application, which would have expired on the 1st of July 2020, now has until the 30th of September this year to commence development. This gives the applicant a reasonable amount of time to address planning conditions and also to make a start on site. The planning history of the site therefore adds weight to the principle of the development as it's currently presented, and it's considered that there would be no merit in refusing this planning application given that the extant planning permission for the exact same design can be developed. On this basis, it's recommended that the Planning Committee indicate that they are minded to grant planning permission subject to the legal agreement and conditions that are outlined in the committee report. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much, Julie. Going to open it up right away to members. I see any hands here. I've barely got rid of the... Yep. Councillor Bowes first, yep.
Thank you. Julie, just I should probably ask you this question before the meeting, but I'll ask it now. The site that's there, the Tappernail site that has got so many houses on it, how would this affect? I know it's been refused, but and it may go to a reporter or whatever. But does this affect the number of houses that are on the plot in that? Because I know they're at the maximum already. Would this put it over the maximum?
Julie?
That's a very good point made, Councillor. The application that's currently with Scottish Ministers for the Persimmon Homes development, which was refused by the Council, was originally in the Local Development Plan 1 a much larger site, H69, which included this application site, land to the north for a single plot, which is referred to in the report, and land between this plot and the Persimmon Homes site for 3 houses. So it was a much larger site. In the Local Development Plan 2, that site is now condensed, site H21, and that allocation is just the Persimmon Homes site, if we refer it to as the Persimmon Homes site. So in effect, this application site, the single plot to the north of this site and the 3 houses to the west of this site, which all have extant planning permission, meaning that they can all still be implemented, are now in the countryside. So the determination of this application should have no bearing on the appeal that's currently with Scottish Ministers for the Persimmon Homes application.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks for a very, very good answer.
Thank you. Councillor Grant?
Thank you, Provost. Convener, sorry, and good morning, Julie. Could I refer to pages 32 and 4.3 about the the applications considered with the concept of other planning applications for when they're wanting £2,334. Could you explain, Joey, why it's come into this?
Yes, that's another very good question. When this application was originally considered, along with the other two plots that I've referred to, the single plot to the north of this site, the plot with the 3 houses to the west of this site, and the larger Persimmon Homes application, these all formed part of a larger housing allocation, which was H69. And although they were separate planning applications, the impact of these developments, should they all be developed and built on site, would be of a larger housing development. And on that basis, we took the view that it was reasonable for the smaller applications to also make a contribution in relation to open space and education, because the overall impact of all of these developments together in the one housing allocation could have an impact on these service provisions. What we did not do for any of the smaller applications was take a contribution for the bus service provision, because, as you know, the Persimmon Homes application, when it was originally determined, that was taken out of the recommendation. So it was only contributions for open space and education, and that's been across all applications in that area. This new application has been reassessed. There was a legal agreement with the 2016 application that this one seeks to renew, so there would be a new legal agreement, which again just relates to open space and education contributions, and it's for a slightly reduced amount, which just is in line with a current assessment. So if members were minded to grant this application on that basis, there would be a new legal agreement that we would proceed. Thanks.
Any more questions, Councillor Grant?
Julie, thanks, convener. Julie, if the Persimmon site wasn't passed with the Scottish Government, would that affect this?
The housing site H21, which the Persimmon Homes application currently relates to, if Scottish ministers didn't approve that appeal, it's still an allocated housing site in our local development plan too. So there's clearly an aspiration by the council that site should be developed for housing, and together with the other 2 plots that have extant planning permission, there's another 4 houses there. So I'm of the view that it's still reasonable to progress on that basis.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. It's Councillor Blackwood, Councillor McCluskey, then Councillor Nimmo. Councillor Blackwood.
Thanks, convener. Julie, I may be missing something here, but this application was approved by the Planning Review Committee in 2017, so, and you say it's still a live application, so why is it back in front of us again? Can you just go ahead and build it if the planning permission is still a live application?
Thank you, Councillor Blackwood. Clearly the applicant is looking for some extra time to be able to develop the site. This application was granted on the 10th of July 2017. So there was a bit of delay there, obviously, with it going to the review committee, and then we obviously had to conclude a legal agreement. They have until September this year because of the Coronavirus Act. But that's quite a tight time scale if the person needs to purify their planning conditions and also get a building warrant. I think what this application is aiming to do is to give the applicant a bit more time to develop their proposals.
Thanks, Julie.
Okay, Councillor McCluskey, then Councillor Nimmo. Councillor McCluskey.
Hi, convener. I'm quite happy to progress with the officer's recommendation here, and quite rightly the fact that whether or not the other application goes ahead, it's still doing for houses, and I think the contribution to education in that should be asked for. In California in the past, they built 100 of the newer houses, and they done it plot 1 to plot 100, and it didn't contribute anything, to education, the community, or anything. So officers are doing the right thing here when it's a party which going on round about that gets added to. As I say, Schulhall School's only at 60% capacity. They're looking for a contribution to the Braes and another contribution as well. So I'm quite happy. It was passed by the local review committee, and it's a procedure. So quite happy to go officers' recommendations.
So are you formally moving the
I'll
recommendation?
happy to move it. You know.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Nimmo now.
Yeah, thanks, Provost. I'm happy to second Councillor McCluckie on this occasion, and I'm happy to support the officer's recommendations. I just have the one question for Julie, and it's in relation to section 6.1, the public representation. There was only the one letter of representation received, but I'm just looking for a bit of clarity here. The site, it's alleged that the public were using the site during lockdown. Now, I'm not aware of any public right of way in this area. Could that just be clarified, if there is a public right of way or not?
Julie?
Thank you, Councillor Nimmo. I think what the objector was referring to was representations which were made in relation to the Persimmon Homes application, which weighed heavily on that site, which is a wee bit different in character to this site, which you'll have seen from photographs, that the public were using that area, particularly during lockdown, as an open space resource. And what they were saying in the objection was that if the council refused the Persimmon Homes application on the basis that they felt that that area had some benefit in terms of open space or recreational amenity, then this application should be judged in a similar vein. I don't think that they were suggesting that there was any public right of way through this application site.
Okay, thanks for that.
Okay, just to clarify where we are, we've got a motion moved and seconded to agree the recommendations contained within the report. Would anybody else like to come in at this stage? So are we happy to agree? Agreed. Okay, thank you very much. Now, we're coming up to item 6, which is a major application, and it's 11:15 just now. So at this time, we'll have a comfort break of 10 minutes before we go into this major application. Thank you. So see you back at 25 past. Thank you, everybody. Well, this is item 6 on your agenda this morning. It's a mixed-use development, including residential, employment, commercial and retail use, open space and landscaping with associated infrastructure at land to the east of Gilson Farm, Gilson Crescent, Pullman for Hanstein Limited. It's pages 47 to 94 on your agenda. Now, I'm going to bring Brent Bibbin, our planning officer, in to start this item off. But just to say that there has been a deputation request been made. An application has been made by Mr. Ian Hind, agent for the application, to be received as a deputation to be heard in respect of this item of business. I need the committee's approval that we're going to hear Mr. Hind. I'm quite happy to move that we hear him. Does anybody get any objections for the committee? Are we happy to hear Mr. Hind?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay, fine. Okay, then we'll start this off with our planning officer, Brent Bibbin, who will give us a summary of the report in front of us. Brent, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, convener. This application is a major development and seeks planning permission in principle for a mixed-use development, including residential, employment, commercial and retail uses. The principal elements of the proposed development are residential land for approximately 500 dwellings, 25% of which would be affordable. A mixed-use area for employment, retail, commercial and community uses, and a neighbourhood centre. A major new area of connected open spaces and a wetland, linked by green corridors and active travel routes. Areas for recreation and sports. Transportation-related works, including a new roundabout on Gilson Crescent, provision of a bus route through the site, an internal street network, and offside road improvement works, and associated SUDS landscaping and engineering works. The site lies to the east of Polmont and extends to approximately 54 hectares. Bounded to the east is the A801, Gilston Crescent to the west, the A803 and junction 4 of the M9 to the north, and the main Edinburgh to Glasgow railway line is to the south. The site is predominantly gently undulating with few distinctive features or landforms. although the land does rise more steeply over the southern portion of the site to meet the level of the railway line. The predominant surface feature is open grassland. Nicolton Road passes through the site, running roughly parallel to a wooded embankment of the A801 forming the eastern site boundary. The Gilston Burn flows through the site from southeast to northwest and is deeply incised in the northwest area. Section 3 of the report sets out the site history. It's an extensive planning history associated with this site. I'd note in particular an application was approved in 2009 on appeal that was for a mixed-use development for class 4, 5 and 6 uses, and that was in accordance with the economic development allocation at that time. More recently, an application was refused in June 2019 for development of the site for mixed residential and commercial uses. The allocation at that time was as an economic development allocation, and there was no allocation at that time for housing as part of the allocation. More recently, the Gilston site has been considered through the Local Development Plan 2 process. In the proposed plan published in September 2018, the Council considered that the site should remain allocated exclusively for economic development purposes. This was subject to subsequent representation from Hanstein Limited to the effect that the site should be allocated instead as a mixed-use proposal, including provision for 500 houses, which would form a strategic growth area. The issue was considered at the LDP examination held between October 2019 and March 2020. Hanstein's representation was supported by the examination reporters, who recommended that the site be allocated for mixed use, in the context of wider findings that insufficient housing land had been allocated in the proposed plan. The examination report was considered at the meeting of Falkirk Council on 30 June 2020. The reporter's recommendation was accepted, and the appropriate modification was made to the plan prior to adoption, meaning that the current allocation for the site is a mix of housing and economic development related uses. Section 4 of the report summarises the consultation responses, and I would highlight the following points from those consultation responses. The Council's Roads Development Unit has advised that a local consultation process would be required prior to any changes to Nicolton Road, as well as a stopping up order if any section of this road was to be removed from the list of public adopted roads. They would support closure of Nicolton Road between the A803 and a suitable location near the southern boundary of the site, with the section in between these 2 points becoming a rural lane for use by pedestrians, cyclists and horse riders, and access to the remaining section of Nicolton Road being provided via the new street network within the actual development site. The Council's Environmental Protection Unit satisfied with the air quality assessment and the odour and dust risk assessments which have been submitted in support of the application. The Council's Transport Planning Unit has agreed mitigation measures to increase capacity at a number of off-site junctions within the local area, including the Lathallan roundabout. They also advised that the applicant would be required to fund improvements to the existing bus services, including improved access to the railway station. That's the Polmont railway station by public transport. SEPA have removed their objection to the application, which was on flood risk grounds, subject to conditions to demonstrate that there would be no increased flood risk associated with any proposals for culverting within the site or restoration or realignment proposals in relation to the Gilston burn. SEPA have also advised that there may be potential of a nuisance due to the proximity of the site to Avondale landfill site. Landfill gas is the source of the majority of site odours, and it could take a considerable amount of time for the landfill to stop producing gas. This means that odours could continue to be a risk long after the site stops accepting waste. They advised the council to consider whether locating a proposed mixed-use development, including housing, is compatible with the existing SEPA-regulated waste management site at Avondale, which may have detectable residual odour. Such residual odour may not necessarily represent non-compliance with the site licence conditions, and they suggest that the council may wish to consider if adequate separation distances have been incorporated into the development. Now, in response to this matter, it is important to highlight that the application site is in fact allocated for mixed-use development under the local development plan, so that the general principle of a mixed-use development, including housing, is established. The development framework for the site reflects the key principle of the guidance for this major area of change under the local development plan of directing the business uses to the eastern part of the site, with the more sensitive housing use to the west and south. Compliance with this key principle, coupled with the mitigation measures set out in the applicant's odour impact assessment, should adequately mitigate the risk while ensuring that the proposed development would not adversely impact on the existing waste management operations. As I mentioned before, the Council's Environmental Protection Unit are satisfied with the submitted odour impact assessment. The Council's Children's Services have advised that the proposal would give rise to capacity issues at St Margaret's Primary School, Graham High School, and in terms of local nursery provision as well. They request pro rata contributions at the rates set out in the Council's supplementary guidance for development contributions. NHS Forth Valley have advised that the two medical practices that would serve the proposed development are operating at capacity, and they have calculated a healthcare contribution in response to that capacity issue, but they would also like to discuss with the applicant the option of a potential health centre or similar facility actually within the application site. That's in the context that NHS Forth Valley have not to date identified an actual space solution to address the capacity issue. So that matter is ongoing. The Polmont Community Council has not made any representations to the application. The Brightons Community Council has objected to the application on the grounds set out in paragraph 5.2 of the report. In addition, there's been a total of 32 public representations. These consist of 22 objections, 4 neutral representations, and 6 representations in support. The matters raised in those objections are set out in paragraphs 6.1 and 6.2 of the report, and include concerns in relation to the local development plan, the actual land use proposed, the scale of development, infrastructure concerns, traffic and road safety concerns. There's a number of comments around sustainable transport and public transport, and also in relation to amenity and flooding and drainage. Turning to the local development plan, the application site lies within the urban village limits under the plan and is identified as a mixed use opportunity and a major area of change, and also a strategic growth area, and it also forms part of the Eastern Gateway strategic business location. Development guidance for this major area of change is set out in the plan and includes the key principles set out in paragraph 7a.4 of the report, and a number of other requirements which are set out in paragraph 7a.5 of the report. The application is accompanied by a development framework as required by the plan for this major area of change. The development framework largely embraces the key principles of the plan guidance, while some of the principles would be considered further at detailed planning stage. It's worthy to note that there is a significant flooding constraint on the site, which has been identified in more detail through an updated flood risk assessment. And this has meant that the extent of open space is greater than shown on the indicative map, which is within the local development plan. This means that in retaining provision for 500 houses, the actual provision for business land is less than what is indicated on the indicative map in the development plan. Consideration of the business land has also been informed by a study carried out by the applicant. The study identified that there is little prospect of the delivery of large-scale industrial or office premises at the site based on market evidence, current occupational demand levels, and competition from other available business locations. The application therefore provides for a broader range of employment generating uses, including land for smaller business spaces alongside an opportunity for a startup business enterprise complex, while maintaining the strategic importance of the site for economic development. The exact type and mix of employment generating uses would be informed by a new comprehensive marketing process following any grant of planning permission in principle. The report from paragraph 7A.8 then moves on into the detailed policy assessment against the relevant local development plan policies covering placemaking, environment, housing, business and infrastructure aspects. Overall, the application is considered to accord with the local development plan. The report then goes on to consider material considerations. Those in this instance are the Council's supplementary guidance, the consultation responses and the representations received, and in paragraph 7B.5 of the report, a response is set out in relation to the matters raised in the representations. In conclusion, Convener, the application is considered to accord with the local development plan. It is therefore recommended for approval, subject to the satisfactory conclusion of the Section 75 planning obligation and appropriate planning conditions. As noted, the site has a mixed-use allocation and is a major area of change under the plan. And the proposed development is considered to provide a significant opportunity for housing, business and green space uses, while promoting successful placemaking through a master plan approach, addressing road, education and healthcare impacts associated with a development of the scale, and providing good access to bus services, including the provision of a new bus service to link to Polmont Railway Station. There are not considered to be any material planning considerations to otherwise justify refusal of the application. The recommended terms of the Section 75 planning obligation are set out in paragraph 9.1a of the report, and the recommended conditions to attach to any grant of planning permission in principle are set out in paragraph 9.1.b of the report. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you for your summary. Brent, could I say this at the very beginning, that I'm very disappointed that this such major application that's been in for 24 years was put on a weekly list and it didn't come straight to committee. I had to call this application in to allow scrutiny by members on planning issues and references to representations received and impacts on infrastructure. Could also say at this stage that I'm a bit disappointed that there was no photographs to tie in with your summary, Brent. I think that was really unfortunate. And apologies to Mr. Hine and his colleagues, but I think that there must be an opportunity here for this committee to see the problems that could be associated with this development. And I'm going to formally move at this stage that we go to sites. Councillor Bowes.
Thank you, Provost. Firstly, can I say there is actually a very detailed report. I appreciate what you say about the photographs. but covering a complex multitude of areas, which reflects a lot of work by planning officers and I've got to say the developer as well, as it should be with a major development. Given the size of the development and considerations of the locality of such a project, I would happily second the Provost that we conduct a site visit, and obviously we'll have some clarifications we'll look for. I think on this it would be very similar to the one we did at Earth with officers, so that we can ask questions and ask for clarifications when we're there. Provost, if you're okay with that.
I'm happy
I
with that.
I think that was a very successful site visit, to be honest with you. So if you're happy with that, a couple of things for me, and just so that there's some idea of why I'm asking, what impact the proposed layout of the layout and land of the development might have in flood issues and any impacts on the adjoining land and properties, the proximity of the landfill site and the potential and any proposed developments on matters such as odours and environmental impacts. Although some of that's covered in the report, it's not all covered. And also in the report, it mentions master planning. And it would probably be a good opportunity for the committee to see some of the master planning, which I know we've spoke about in the past, Provost, and hopefully you support that as well. But there may be other stuff for other people to cover.
Delighted with that, and I'm sure we'll have officers out for all areas, but obviously we need the agreement of the rest of the committee. So I've moved. Councillor Nimmo, you want to come in, sir? Thank you.
Just quickly, as one of the local members, Provost, you'll be well aware that I don't normally support site visits, but I think on this occasion there needs to be an exception made because of the size of the development, and I'm happy to support that. Just, it was mentioned that Polmont Community Council hadn't submitted any objections or any information at all. I'm just wondering if this application was advertised during the problems we've had with the planning portal.
We'll maybe bring in our plan. Bernard, would you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, just to clarify, Councillor Nimmo, this application, as you'll see from the reference number, has been in a fairly lengthy period already. So it would predate the recent problems that we had with the planning portal.
All right, okay.
So yeah, they would have.
I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks, Bernard.
Okay, we've got a motion moved and seconded. Is there anybody otherwise minded, or we're going to have an unaccompanied site visit? Agreed?
Councillor Kerr.
Councillor Kerr. Councillor Kerr.
Just a quick one, Provost, for Brent. I'm quite happy to support the site visit. What I would like to look when we go is the area for the housing development compared to the size of the site, where it would be, and what would be left, and a better understanding of the layout, Provost.
Yeah.
But and as you say, I think this needs to be done as soon as possible. As you say, 20 odd years. It's unfair for the developer. It's unfair for council. It's unfair for the residents. So if we get it as soon as we can, eh?
Okay, fine. Councillor McCluckie.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm also happy to go to sites, but we're getting to the end of the term and then new councillors taking in. So it's to ken, would it be ready for, I think, next month's the last meeting, or if we've done in the past with such a major impact, because of the time this has been lying, can we make the decision after the site meeting, the site visit kind of thing? Or, you know, I'm trying to think what the way forward would be. Also, if we're going to the site, I know it's unaccompanied, but I would like some more information on a couple of things, and maybe if officers could look into that in the meantime.
You want? We've got just to let you know on the date. We'll have a date in the diary for a site visit, and it's the 28th of this month, which would give us enough time before the elections.
That's fine, Mayor. But what I'm saying is, SEPA's got stuff in here about. It's not very strongly worried. We've not got much faith in SEPA. The potential for nuisance, you know, about smells and that. And there may be the possibility of the trees being a partial barrier to the smells. I don't think, but have we not got any biodiversity officer that could come to see if there anything, can you put plants or stuff in that would help with the smell or different things? And to me, there's maybe some other information that would be beneficial to this application. If you get mine.
Well, officers will take all these comments on board, and I'm quite sure that we'll have enough officers on site to answer any questions. The visual impact of the whole site with the questions that Councillor Bowes and Councillor Kerr they're really relevant, and that's how I think a site visit would be most appropriate. Anybody else like to come in? Are we agreed the site visit? Agreed. Okay, thank you. And once again, apologies to Mr. Hind and his colleagues, but this is a major application that's been with this council since 1998, and we want to ensure that we're looking at all avenues of this and the representations that have been made before the decisions have been taken. So thank you very much for your forbearance. Thank you. Okay then, that takes us to item 7 on your agenda today. Is the redevelopment of the former Manuel Brickwork site, mixed-use development comprising approximately 400 residential dwellings, associated local retailing and community facilities class 1, 2 and 3, and approximately 29,000 total gross area of commercial units, 10% class 4, business and 90% class 6, storage distribution at land to the east of Almond Farm for Araker Developments Limited. It's pages 95 to 156. And the update report is coming from Brent Vivian again. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you, Convener. Members will recall that the Planning Committee decided on the 21st of April 2021 that it was minded to grant planning permission in principle in respect of this application, subject to the completion within 6 months of a Section 75 planning obligation, and thereafter a remit to the Director of Place Services to grant planning permission in principle subject to appropriate conditions. The full wording of the decision is set out in paragraph 1 of the report. Unfortunately, the 6-month period for completing the Section 75 planning obligation was not able to be met. To a large extent, this was due to the scale and nature and related complexities associated with the required contributions and the need for further information to progress consideration and establish agreement on those matters. However, matters have now progressed to a point where a draft of the Section 75 is largely completed. At the time of writing this report, there remains some ongoing consideration and discussion in relation to open space and healthcare. Discussions are now largely concluded in relation to open space, and the applicant has agreed to the provision of a 7-a-side football pitch within the actual application site area, and that'll be tied into the Section 75 terms. In relation to healthcare, a formal consultation response from NHS Forth Valley was only received on the 25th of January and was being considered at the time of writing this report. Since then, we have provided comments to NHS Forth Valley in relation to their response, and a response in turn from NHS is awaited. In addition, NHS have been furnished with a copy of a letter from the applicant querying the healthcare contribution, and that's in the context of the absence at the moment of an identified space solution to address the capacity issue at Meadowbank Health Centre, and a response on that is also awaited from NHS Forth Valley. So this matter is ongoing. All in all, good progress has been made so far in relation to the planning obligation, albeit it's taken longer than perhaps we would have wanted. And it is considered that a further 3 months should be afforded to allow for the obligation to be progressed and hopefully concluded. The recommendation, therefore, is that the committee agree that it is minded to grant planning permission in principle in accordance with all respects with its decision on the 21st of April 2021, except the timescale for completion of the Section 75 is extended to the 16th of May 2022. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Brent. I'm quite happy to move the recommendation. Just to say this, that Section 75s, especially with big sites, can be very complex and can take some time. If members who've been here for a long period of time would realise that that was the problem with the initial site, where there was 1,500 houses that were to be allocated for this site. And what happened was, never during the period of that time, we had numerous applications that came forward for this site. Was a Section 75 ever agreed? And therefore, after, I think it was 12 years, we decided eventually that we'd be refusing the application. There was a determination by council and members to try and ensure that this site would go ahead for the regeneration of that White Cross area. And that's how we continually, when it came to committee, continually said, right, okay, we'll give it another 6 months, we'll give it another 6 months. And eventually, after 10 years, members realised that it was never going to be fulfilled. So it's very encouraging that after only 6 months, that we're at a stage where Section 75 could maybe be completed here. Councillor Kerr.
Thanks, Provost. I'd just like to ask Bernard a couple of questions, Provost.
Fine.
So what you're saying is we're waiting in the NHS getting back to us. We're happy with all the rest of the conditions.
Bernard?
Yeah, if I can come in on that, it's detailed in the report. We have had some comments back from NHS Forth Valley very recently, which are being considered. I don't know if Brent wants to add anything further. He did give some comments in his summary. Was there anything further on that, Brent, that you wanted to add?
Well, not really. Just to reiterate that we've looked at the response from NHS Forth Valley, and we have gone back to them with some comments, and that includes a submission from the applicant. So at this point in time, we're waiting for NHS to come back on those points. It may well be that they update or tailor their consultation response to take into account those points that we've raised.
My next question is, what if they didn't come back in the 3 months?
If I can come in on that, just to explain the reason why we set a 6-month timescale on this was really to give some focus to avoid drift and focus people's minds on progressing a Section 75. Obviously, given the scale and type of development and the complexities involved, we haven't been able to do that, but there has been good progress. The indications are that we are hopeful that we should be able to conclude within a further 3-month period. If not, then we'd look to bring it back further to members. But I think the important thing for me in this, and as the Provost referred to, it's a positive message here that things do seem to be moving forwards.
I understand that, but as in the previous application, that then becomes a new council, and if it's no decided in the 3 months, can it not be done quicker than that? If it's the NHS we're waiting on, and we're happy with everything else, can it not be done quicker? It's just a question.
Yeah, well, certainly, if we can do it quicker than 3 months, then we'll be keen to do that. Obviously, some of this is out with our hands and in the hands of the applicants as well. We're looking at Section 75, and that requires both the council and the applicants to sign up and agree to the terms. So certainly on our part as officers, I would say yes, we'll do what we can to get it through as quickly as we can.
Fine.
Thanks, Bernard. Thanks, Professor.
Aye.
It's been, as you say, that your opening statement is like the previous application, has been a long process. This application is probably 4 years just for this application, and it's going to see our time as elected members out, and it might go the next elected members. Thanks, Provost.
Maybe just come back on that point, because obviously that it's very positive, this report, but going back to previous applications, and we've mentioned this before, Bernard was mentioned it to Mr Henderson, the lack of, and I know that Councillor Murtagh came in the last time in relation to the fact that maybe criticism has been levelled at the NHS because of their lack of response. And I'm not just talking about during the time of COVID. I'm talking about even years before that. It's been very difficult to get these people to respond. But the fact is that in relation to the recommendation contained within the last other reports, you can the conditions been put in relation to a proportionate contribution towards addressing healthcare capacity could be incorporated. So it's something to think about. Councillor McLuckie.
Thanks, Provost, for letting me in on this very important item. And like I says, I was going to meetings in Whitecross prior to be a councillor 15 years ago, and the people have been sitting waiting on this development and the job opportunity since then. So I look forward to it moving, and it's good to hear officers believing that they should be able to conclude this within the 3 months. But you know, the issues is that when we look at health board to come back, you know, it takes them years. It reminds me of horse abbey last week, you know, it was that slow. And here we give people 6 months, and then 9 months later, after we've passed the application that's been in for all these years, the health board writes to us. So, you know, and I know the officers have been trying, because I've asked officers what's happening, and officers have tried, you know, very hard in this to meet the requirements, and I know that the developer has listened to the officers as well. So you're right, I hope we can conclude this very quickly. The only other point I had was in relation to the open space, and I was glad to see that an agreement's been reached. But you said an agreement including a 7-a-side football park. Now, obviously there's an obligation to meet on-site or off-site provision, active and passive open space, but the community up there was always suggesting they will go to Whitecross School, and for 15 years the people were up there. In fact, education officers were up because of the issue, seeing you know, if extra houses went, was there capacity to decide for extension and to look at a mugger pitch. Now, clearly, you know, the developer can only go and work with what officers are suggesting, but the idea is worked so well at so many other schools is that that's what people use. We've got football parks in Slomanan, you know, Avon Bridge, California, Shield Hill, none of which get used, right? They just lie, they're nice green spaces, but they just didn't get used. But we're mugger pitches, you know, next to schools. The schools utilise them all through the day, the pupils, and then the community use them in the evenings. And as I say, I'm just thinking that, you know, seeing there's agreement, but why we weren't looking at that and you know, that possibility instead of the 7-a-side spits, because where you put open space or other facilities doesn't really matter. But obviously education was up there and says that there's plenty of room for a mugger years ago. So as I say, I just didn't see why we didn't do that instead of a football park. That the council, we don't really support now. The trust didn't support because of no money to support drainage and that on them in the future. So it was just a point, but at the end of the day, I don't want it to hold the decision, seeing that officers and developers are working so hard for conclusion.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hughes, did you want in?
Yes, I did actually, convener. I'm a bit more of a stickler when it comes to agreements. And on page 96, is minded to grant planning and principle subject to the completion within 6 months of today's date. When it's written down, convener, would you not agree that if there is slippage, as you quite rightly point out with major developments, there is slippage, but should the committee not have had a quick report within the 6-month period or just after to say that that this would actually be extending, because it's written down for the public domain that it would the 6 months of today's date, 21st of April, and we're now discussing this 10 months after the event. So shouldn't the committee have been given a heads up to say after the 6 months, well, actually, it will need a bit more time?
Well, on that particular point, I'll maybe bring an officer in, but I reiterated at the very beginning of the last item that we're 24 years down the line, no 6 or 10 months. And this one here, it was 12 years before the committee decided that they weren't going to extend it any further. This is only 6 months. It's already been explained to you about the complexity of Section 75. And for officers to come forward at this stage and say that they're really nearly there, then I think it's well, let's hand it to the officers for the tremendous work they've done in this. But this is, I think, the first time that I've ever had officers that have come forward and had been so positive in a major application like this on timescale. Before, going back to Whitecross, for over 10 years, we just had applications coming forward to grant a continuation because the Section 75 agreement hadn't been signed.
Well,
when we go back to the previous application, yeah, I know where you're coming from.
I would never disagree with you, convener, but I still think there is a fundamental point of respect to the committee.
Right. Well, we never said anything like that in relation to the last application. You take everyone in its merits. The fact is, as far as I'm concerned, this is positive. The officer, when he submitted it, had told us quite clearly that there were nearly crossed the line, but there were still some issues still outstanding. We spoke about the healthcare, and I stated quite clearly that it's happened before, is that you can put a condition in relation to that that would cover it. And if we go back just to say that a condition can be put in terms of if it was only the healthcare, we don't really know. A proportionate contribution towards addressing healthcare capacity issues can be put in there. So that would stymie that one. But the fact of the matter is, Gordon, I've got to be honest and say this, that 10 months or whatever in relation to a major application like this that was over 12 years in the making isn't unreasonable. And as I say, I've already moved that we grant the recommendation contained within the report. I've not had a seconder yet, so it's still open. Councillor McCluskey?
I'm happy to second it, convener.
No, Councillor Blackwood seconded. Okay, is anybody else want to come in? Are we happy with it? Happy to agree? Thank you very much.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. And once again, can I thank everybody once again? Be very safe out there today because the winds are going to be really bad this evening, so be very careful when you're driving, and let's hope that everybody keeps safe. Other than that, thank you very much for your contribution.